I'm happy to see such a great turnout because this is a topic that we believe should really be important to everyone in the industry, irrespective of gender, because it has such a great potential impact. So thank you so much for being here today, and thank you to the SSP organizers for having us here. And a special shout out to Laura Ricci, who was our SSP shepherd, for making this so easy on us. Thank you. So in August 2013, our moderator, Alice Meadows, wrote a post for the Scholarly Kitchen entitled, "Why Aren't There More Women at the Top in Scholarly Publishing?" And as the best blog posts do, it generated significant comment online. And many of these comments focused on the fact that the commenters, particularly some men, didn't seem to think that there was a problem. They pointed out great examples of female leaders. And this struck, oh, geez. All right, we're actually just doing the cover slide so people don't get confused. So thank you for that, though. So many of the comments focused on the fact that people would point out different examples of female leaders and say, well, we don't believe that there actually is a problem. And this struck us as well-meaning but ultimately misguided. Certainly, there are plenty of examples of excellent female leaders, but this doesn't mean that there's not a gender gap or that we shouldn't strive for parity. Still, these comments led us to do a bit more digging. So, as you might expect from the general composition of the organizations that you work with, scholarly publishing tends to attract more women than men. So of the 956 members on the SSP roster last year when we did our analysis, 58% are women. But how many of these women, we wondered, were at the very top of their respective organizations, and not directors of publishing or editorial directors or directors of communications? Even though these are excellent leadership positions, our question were, who are at the very top? Who are the board chair and who's the board CEO? So to answer this question, granted in a very limited preliminary analysis, we looked at SSP's organizational membership list, 68 organizations that represent a cross-section of the industry, nonprofits, for-profits, university presses, tech groups, other organizations. And we looked at who is their board chair and who is their CEO. And what we found, slightly disappointing, but perhaps not surprising, 24% had a female board chair, had a female CEO, and 17% currently had a female chair. So 24% and 17% compared to an industry where the composition is 58% female. So the issue of the gender gap is, I would argue, relatively clear. But what is less clear is what we as an industry might do about it. Hence this great discussion today. So without further ado, I'd like to turn this over to our panelists. We have a few questions for them to start out with, but then we're going to save about 20 minutes of this short session at the end to turn it out to the audience for your questions and comments. So our goal is to really have this be an interactive session. So I am Lauren Kane, Bio1 COO, and my co-organizer and moderator today is Alice Meadows. And in addition to penning sometimes inflammatory articles on the Scholarly Kitchen, Alice recently joined ORCID as their Director of Communications. We are also pleased to welcome Angela Cochran, who is the Director of Journals for the American Society of Civil Engineers, and also the President of the Council of Science Editors. We also have Sara McNamara, Associate Editor for Oxford University Press, Mady Tissenbaum, Publisher of the Journal of Bone and Joint Surgery, and Ann Michael, President of Delta Think, and President, as of 8 a.m. this morning, of SSP. And though I've provided their affiliations, of course, everything we say today, the views are our own. So without further ado, Alice.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay, well, I just want to, before we start, I just want to say one additional thank you. Thank you very much to the panel, as Lauren says, and also thank you to Lauren, who really was the kind of driving force behind this, because although I wrote the blog post nearly 2 years ago, I always wanted to do something more with it, but I hadn't got around to it, and she had this great idea, so thank you, Lauren. So we do, as Lauren said, we want to keep this very informal. That's why we've still perched on our stools at the front, but an attempt to be a little bit more inclusive. We really want to hear from you. And in fact, my first question, both for the panel and for the room, is, does anybody think there is not a problem? And this is a genuine, this isn't a loaded question, because I think there probably are. You know, we've all spoken to people who believe there isn't a problem, and there may be people, among us who think that. So does anybody think there is not a problem with a sort of lack of women at the top?
Let's give them a nice round of applause.
Yes, thank you. Well, Emma,
Robert, sit down.
Heel, Robert.
But it's actually a really good point, because I think, I'm sure this is going to come up later, but one of the issues that, as we prepared for this talk, we all felt is that, there is a tendency for this to be seen as a women's problem, and that women need to solve it by getting better at whatever, or being less whatever. And actually, it's an issue for all of us, isn't it? We're all conscious of, we're all guilty of sort of unconscious bias. We're all guilty of, we all have our own agendas, basically. So I think it's a really good point, and thank you to those many of you in the audience. And we really would like to hear from you, please. But okay, so basically, I think we're agreed that there is a problem, and so where do we go from here? So our first question for the panel is: do you think there's a problem? So I'm guessing broadly yes, as none of you put your hands up. And what's your personal experience? What's led you to believe that there is or isn't a problem?
My name is Sara McNamara again. I am representative kind of the early career track person in scholarly publishing. I came to Oxford University Press and Publishing after completing a PhD in philosophy. And if you want to talk about an area where there's a problem with women and sometimes open hostility towards women in graduate programs, undergraduates, it's philosophy. And so I think coming from that world, I feel much more optimistic about the what I see when I look into a room. This is quite uncommon to see in a philosophy conference, a room full of women, a panel of all women. And so I'm encouraged by that, but I think the thing I'd like to focus on is the fact that even though there isn't that open hostility, sometimes the lack of that hostility, it makes it even more insidious when the little tiny slights happen, or the someone feels overlooked, or a woman ends up doing the kind of office housework. We can congratulate ourselves that there are so many women and that there are some women in leadership positions, but when those little things kind of multiply over a course of years, over the course of someone's career, it's just as insidious as the open hostility, the openly negative environment in academic philosophy where I come from. So
I think that we have an opportunity, and I think things are better than they used to be. And I think things are different depending on where we're coming from. Just in phone call conversations that we've had in preparation for this panel, people who worked for commercial publishers have a completely different experience than maybe some of us who came from society publishers. And then the type of societies that we come from also makes a difference. I've worked for 10 years now with the American Society of Civil Engineers. I can tell you that 99.9% of the editorial board meetings that I attend, I'm one of the only women in the room, and everybody's nodding their heads, so that's happening to you too. The other women in the room are the people on my team. And it's funny because the editorial boards will talk about diversity. Like all of a sudden they'll talk about, okay, let's talk about diversity. I'm like, oh, this is it. Okay, this is our moment. And they talk about, well, maybe we should have people from different subject specialties on the editorial board. I'm like, not really what I was thinking. And then they talk about, diversity, people from different countries. I'm like, all right, I'm going to wait for it. I'm just going to wait for it. Somebody's going to say, we need to be talking about women. And only maybe a quarter of them, somebody does actually say, hey, should we be talking about the fact that there's no women on our editorial board? And I leave. And then in another 90% of those quarter percent of the cases, somebody says, well, there's women on staff. Doesn't that count? And then I just bang my head on the desk. And I look up at them with this disappointed look on my face, and I say, no, that doesn't count. So, I think for some of us, the challenges of rising to the top there's rising to the top in our organizations. There's becoming a leader in our field, and we'll get into this, I guess, a little more later. But there's also, those challenges of establishing ourselves as the expert in what we do with our editorial boards, and that's something that I spend a lot of time thinking about.
Angela, just out of interest, how many members are women in your organisation, roughly?
Not many. We have 35 journals and 2 female chief editors. That is roughly representative of the overall membership.
Thank you. Okay.
So I actually have a really hard time with this topic, and Alice and I, we've had our discussions about this. And the reason is it's kind of a double-edged sword. So on the one hand, I can tell you that certainly throughout my career I have absolutely been impacted by the fact, and prior to publishing, I worked in technology for many years. I had a technically kind of focused career for 17 years before I got into medical publishing and then STM publishing more broadly. And there are lots of times when I sit retrospectively and look at my career. I was in 9 different industries. I pretty much had another job every 2 years. And when I kind of reflect on why, I never ever really felt discriminated against. I never felt slighted. I never felt those things. I was completely oblivious. When I look back retrospectively, I say, wow, actually, every time I left and I look at why I left someplace and why I went somewhere else, it was because I couldn't get where I wanted to go. And when I looked at why I couldn't get where I wanted to go, I found this pattern. I found a pattern of getting a job, getting promoted usually within 6 months, and then right around 2 years realizing no one was ever going to let me do anything else. And saying, well, that's their loss. Next. And so I didn't really notice, and I didn't really see why until I started to take stock of who were my employers, who were my bosses in various, and what had happened. And I started to realize that, wow, there actually had been this pattern that I hadn't recognized. And I'm really thankful I didn't recognize it, because the double-edged sword that I was talking about is that it's really easy to sound like a whiner. It's really easy to sit there and whether the issue's legitimate or not, it has nothing to do with the legitimacy of the issue, but those hearing the discussion can very often start to think that, we're just whining. And when you add that to a culture of, isn't there something else you could do, or isn't there this other thing, you wonder, does that help more or hurt more? And so I have this reluctance. Honestly, it's as I said, I am kind of torn that, on the one hand, I definitely recognize the issue and I believe it is an issue. And on the other hand, I have to keep reminding myself that everybody in this room, male or female, we're all different. We all approach problems differently. We all approach work differently. We all approach family differently. We all have differences. And for me, what kind of worked was saying, was going back. I'm the youngest of 4, and it was kind of just like with my big brothers. Oh yeah, well, fine. I'm going to go do this, and I realized that I managed my career that way for 18 years without even realizing it. That when that happened, I said, fine, and I moved on, and that isn't going to work for everybody, and it shouldn't have to be that way. So that's kind of where I'm torn. So yes, it was definitely an impact. It's there and I see it. But when we get to the next questions about what to do about it, that's really where I get torn and where some of us may or may not agree. So I'll hand it over to Mady.
Okay. Thank you. I'm conflicted about this issue for completely, probably different reasons. I've been in the industry for more than 40 years. When I started going to meetings like this one, there were so few women in the room that I would count to see, is it 5%, is it 10%? I mean, there's been a huge change. But I think that as I look back on my career and why haven't I gotten farther, and there's not that much farther I'm going to be able to get in sort of my area, is it was largely a female group. And one of the problems may actually be that there are so many women at the lower and middle levels that we're only competing with one another and only learning from one another. So we're missing a whole set of skills that we don't see on a day-to-day basis, and a whole personality type that we are not working with. Right now, my organization has, I think, 10% men. There was one man when I started working there, and he was in a position of power. So we weren't learning from one another. It wasn't an integrated group. So it, in a way, doesn't surprise me it's not integrated at the top. It's not diverse at the top because that's where the men are. And I don't know, or some of us don't know, how they operate and why they operate the way they do, because we're never there, because we're not seeing them on their way up, because they're coming from somewhere else. And one of the kind of interesting things also is that a lot of women, unlike Anne, who is very, I think, intrepid, a lot of women don't want to change jobs often. We're a little bit more timid, and a lot of times the people at the top come in from somewhere else, because as long as you're there, they don't recognize you. But I think we just reflect what's happening in the larger culture. And I think we've made a lot of progress, as has the larger culture. One of our problems is there are no men on this panel. But I think it's happening. I think Title IX, I've said this to a few people, probably because a few people have said it to me, but the advent of Title IX is changing the way women think and the way women work. And I think that's going to make a larger change and a faster change than what we've seen so far, because women now have, I think, more self-confidence. They're going to be more comfortable changing jobs when things aren't working for them. Then they're going to learn more things at different jobs and bring new skills, and then they're going to stand up for themselves better. And that's, I don't want to blame the victim, but a lot of us lack self-confidence. I have. So come talk to me. But, you come into this with one set of expectations. It's usually, I just want to have a job. And many of us, certainly historically, less now, I think, don't come in with a career plan. Gender-wise, there are differences there. But as we start to come in with career plans, we're going to push harder. And diversity is good for the company, diversity is good for the industry, diversity is good for, the United States. We're probably never going to get a legally mandated percentage of women on boards the way some European countries have done, because we can't pass the damn Equal Rights Amendment. America's just too diverse to coordinate on anything. But it's happening in some industries. I think the SEC has some rules about it. There are publicly traded companies that are now required to have a certain percentage of women on boards. And the more women we get on boards, the more women are going to seem acceptable and normal and expected on boards, and it's going to continue from there. Are you speaking, or? No, you're just holding me up. In case I fall down, she's holding me up. Okay. Because you're probably going to...
Thank you. And I will just add very briefly from my perspective, I definitely I was coming from a similar place to, I think, you two in some ways, in that I never had a career plan. I never thought more than one sort of stage of my career beyond. And actually, I think that was, in hindsight, a big mistake, because what it meant was there were always women at the next level above me to be my role model, which was fantastic, and I had some fantastic mentors. But when you get to a certain level, all of a sudden you realise that there aren't really any women role models anymore. And, I get on very well with my male colleagues, but it can be a different sort of relationship, whereas often the men at the top have kind of dived down into the organisation and selected not always, but often men who they consider to be, rising stars, and develop them. And conversely, I think, again, this is a crass generalisation, but I think certainly when I joined the industry, men tended to be thinking further ahead than women, or certainly than I did.
Alice, it's funny. I have to comment on that, because it's interesting when you say, like, the two of you, we didn't have a career plan. Oh, I had a plan.
Yeah, well.
I very much. But no, I would like to kind of debate what it means to have a career plan. A career plan, and I have to deal this with my children, 2 boys and 1 girl. What's your career plan? What are you doing? a career plan isn't about mapping out the next 20 years of your life. That's ridiculous. I mean, there's a certain amount of planning and a certain amount of serendipity. A career plan is understanding what's the general direction I want to head in, what are the general things that I would like to accomplish, where would I like to go, and then serendipitously evaluating the things that are available when you are ready and able to make a move or to do something different. And I think it's funny, the reason I pick this up is I think this is one of the things is that somehow along the way, and I see this more often in women than in men, there's this perspective of this map or the fact that someone's going to reach in and help you at different points, or that, and I think that it's great if they do. It's really great. I mean, honestly, I'll put you on the spot. The guys that are in the room, how many of you had mentors, really had mentors? One. And how many of you were in here? All guys, raise your hand. All right. So that's like 6. So one, honestly, this isn't a representative sample, so 1 out of 6. So why would it be any better or different on the women's side? I mean, I think that somehow women get this perception of all these guys kind of holding arms together, making sure that they're all going to progress, and it isn't the case. So it's just a matter of, and the other thing is, the thing that gets me sometimes is sometimes people think that women to be successful have to be like men, and that's the problem. Like, I think the problem is how do women find their rightful place in the ecosystem, leveraging who they are, as Jennifer was saying. That was her name, right? Jennifer? Jenny, okay. As she was saying, and then moving forward from there. And so the planning part was just the point that I wanted to make is that please, 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 please don't leave here thinking that a plan is that you're going to know exactly what you're going to do for the next 15 years, because you're going to be really, well, hopefully you'll be delighted, but it sets you up to potentially be disappointed.
I totally agree, and I didn't mean that sort of a plan. I didn't even know where I particularly wanted to go. I literally, appallingly muddled my way through till I was about 40, and then I started thinking, actually, what I want to do is, broadly, and then it's taken me another best part of 15 years to get to do what I really want to do. So I'm just saying, for me, it was a very long, slow process, and if I'd had a little bit of foresight back in my 20s and thought broadly, this is the kind of organisation I want to work for, this is the kind of, all I was like was, oh, this sounds like an interesting job, I'll have a go at this. And, if I had to tell my 20-something-year-old self something, I would say, just think about broadly what kind of work you want to do, what kind of position you want to be in, and I would have got there a lot quicker. So that was where I was coming from, rather than, I never wanted to map everything out, but I should have thought more big picture about it, and I didn't. So. But it's a really good point. Okay, so the next question, I'm conscious there's no way we're going to get through our questions. Because we really want to leave time for you all to ask questions. So shall we jump straight onto what advice, since actually that's kind of a segue. I've given my advice to a young woman starting out in your career today. Think broadly about what you would like to do, where you would like to get to, not in terms of what that means with career steps, but just have a sense of what's going to make you happy in your working life and strive for it. So, sorry to be rude and go first when I'm the chair, but shall we? One of the questions that we wanted to.
Don't apologize for being in power.
Sorry.
Yay.
Actually, it's very funny because Anne sends me emails sometimes, because I start every email to her saying, sorry I'm late with this, and she's like, stop saying sorry. So sometimes I start my email, I'm sorry, and I'm like, no, delete, she's going to tell me off again.
Put a line through it.
Yeah, exactly. Anyway, so maybe before we move on to audience questions, you would all like to say what your advice would be to either your younger self or to the young women in the room about what you think what your advice would be to them as they progress through their career.
And we've started it. I think it's inevitable. I think my main advice is to find other women and talk to them, and whether it's a reading group, the reading group that meets at the bar where you don't actually discuss the book you've purportedly read, or even purchased. Having that community, the people that you can complain to and talk to and strategize with is invaluable. It was something I luckily started in graduate school. I had a writing group, and we didn't always talk about our writing, and we didn't always talk about anything other than what movie we were going to see, but having that community, that support, that network is invaluable. You know you have that sounding board, the people that you can go talk to that can give you real advice, and then if you have that, even if you feel alone in your department or you feel alone in your company, you won't lack for that support and that community.
So I don't want to go all Sheryl Sandberg on you, but and I totally agree with Jenny this morning that I read the book, and there were parts of it I hated, and there were parts of it I thought were obvious of her privileged background, and then there was some parts that I thought were really interesting and real problems. And one of the things that when I talk to people who are they may be postdocs who are looking, they don't want to do bench work, they're looking to work in publishing, and they somehow end up on the phone with me, or others who are considering going into scholarly publishing, people on the team who are junior to me. You have to participate in whatever it is that you do. The things that I have gotten the most sort of value out of, and also the things that have helped me to progress in my career are things that happen outside of my office. They are my volunteer efforts with the Council of Science Editors. It's coming to meetings. I try very hard to ask a question in every panel I sit in, to be one of those people who raises their hand and asks a question. And that's not actually my comfort level. I very much struggle with meeting people who I've never met before and engaging in groups that I don't know. So I have to put myself beyond my comfort zone and put myself out there. And that's actually how I got involved with the Scholarly Kitchen, which is the largest profile thing. When you meet people and they're like, oh, you're a chef. Like, yes. And it's a little weird. But people read that, and that's very scary. I have to tell you, that's very scary to be writing in Scholarly Kitchen. And it started by commenting. That's just putting myself out there and commenting. But people have to, particularly women. This is the Sheryl Sandberg part, sort of that lean in part. And I think she's right when she talks about how at meetings where there are a lot of men at the table, that there's a confidence problem. Younger women in particular who are not very confident in their expertise, maybe have made suggestions in meetings before and everybody poo-pooed it and thought it was a stupid idea, and so they don't want to comment again. My advice is to keep talking, because if you're the person who's sitting at the table who never says anything, then no one will ever think you have anything to say. So you have to do it. You just have to do it. And if you're going to join a committee to meet people and network, don't be the person on the committee that doesn't do anything. Be the person on the committee who contributes, who has new ideas, who shares what they have to say. If you don't think you have the best idea to contribute, then back up somebody else's best idea. There's nothing wrong with saying, you know what, that's an awesome idea, Anne. I think we should move forward with that. It still puts you in the conversation. So you don't have to, women don't have to put that pressure on themselves of, I have to say the next brilliant thing in this meeting. You just have to participate. And that would be my advice. The more you participate, the more people hear you, the more they think you have something to say. People think I have something to say. I mean, I'm on this panel. People think I have something to say, and that usually shocks me because I don't think I have anything all that groundbreaking to say. But because I say stuff, people think I have something to say. So get involved and, participate.
So this is actually great. So it's broad plan, community, and support, participation. And another thing I think that Jenny said this morning, which is really true too, is that there really isn't a stupid question. That if you've done your homework, there actually are stupid questions, but they're only questions that result from the fact that you didn't have some baseline, that you didn't make an effort to understand what's going on around you. So if you're not listening and you chime in with a question, obviously. But given those aside, my disclaimer, there really aren't stupid questions. And one of the things I think that's a characteristic that unfortunately impacts, I think, women more than men is the imposter syndrome. So, and I have to tell you, I honestly feel this way all the time. I simply ignore it. And that is that no matter what you do, no matter what you accomplish, no matter what you, and you're not alone with your teams, with your groups, with your colleagues, no matter what is accomplished, more women that I see than not have this ability, and I do this to myself, to completely, after that 2-second high of, wow, this was great, to say, wow, that wasn't really hard, and I'm not really good at this, or I'm not really as good as I could be, or I'm not, and again, this is not only with women, men do this too, but I think if I had numbers, I would bank that statistically women tend to do this more than men. Women don't tend to fake it until they make it. They tend to try to go about it the other way, and that might sound harsh, fake it until you make it, but it actually isn't. Think about it more as visualizing where you want to be and what you want to do, and acting that way now in order to get there. So rather than thinking of it as like some ruse, it's actually a great strategy to think about where you want to go and what you want to do, to have that broad plan, to have support, to participate, and to know that you have every right to participate as much as anyone else does, and that you're not going to be perfect, but the fact is that that's how you get where you want to go, by kind of mentally being there before you ever physically arrive. So I would just say that's an important thing to think about. That, and as long as you are willing to ask a question, you aren't pulling anything over on anybody. You're not being disingenuous. You're not lying. What you're saying is, this is where I'm going. This is the path I'm on, and I'm going to be there. Dress for success is kind of another way, on a more physical realm, to think about it. And as long as you're willing to admit when you get to a point where you're not sure about something, or you need support, or you need to ask a question, or you need to phone a friend, you need to use one of your landlines, then that's okay. You're not being untrue.
I have a sign in my office that says "Fake it till you make it," and it's directly across from my desk, so I can see it all the time. I never asked him.
Well, I want to endorse "Fake it till you make it." When I was younger and trying to figure out how to, dress for work and things like that, the trope was, dress like the person who has the job you wish you had. Act like the person who has the job you wish you had. If they walk into a room looking confident, just do it, because people are going to believe you. You may not believe it, but you don't have to believe it. They have to believe it. The other piece, which is almost embarrassing to recommend because we've been saying it forever, is be overqualified. But I'm saying it not so much because you have to be better than the next person in order to get the job that they got last week, but because it'll give you more confidence. You will know that you have that base, and it helps with the imposter feeling, because then you can look around the room and you can go, yeah, but I've got an MBA and they don't. So what I say cannot be as stupid as I think it's going to be. So that works. And a couple of other things are, when you start getting bored in your job, as you will, look around, either for another job or for something else to do where you are, and do informational interviews with people above you and with people in departments where you don't really know what that department does. Because I was probably 35 before I realized that people love to give advice. They will be flattered, probably give you an hour. I wouldn't start with the CEO, but directors of other departments, they really love to do that. And you learn a lot. And you can ask them these questions. How did you get here? Aside from what do, what makes you look at a staff member and think that person's promising? You can really ask those questions, and people they love to give you those answers. And those are very useful. And the other thing is volunteer, because especially if you're shy, it helps incredibly with networking, because then you're networking with friends. You're not networking with strangers once you've started volunteering. SSP has been terrific for me. CSE has been terrific for people in different types of jobs, and a lot of us cross both boundaries. And I started out by going to CSE for about the first 10 years, and then as my job changed, SSP was more valuable for me. But the one last thing, don't ignore business skills. Don't wait on business skills. If you're an English major, you need them more than the other people do, because you will have gaps, and the gaps will hurt you. And I can't tell you how many people in my organization who are, say, in copy editing, want more education, and we send them to things like how to read a P&L for people who are not in the finance department. And they come back and they say, that was really interesting, but it doesn't pertain to my job and I will never use it. And therefore, they never build the skill. They never exercise it. They never try to apply it to maybe their home budget. They just let it go. And then 5 years later, when somebody shows up with a P&L, they have no idea what to do with it. And they, and they look like idiots. Yeah. And then they're not going to get that next promotion, or they're not going to be invited to that next meeting. So if you ask for further education, make the most of it, and pick carefully, for what you're getting. But, if we send you to an Excel class and you come back saying, but I don't use Excel in my daily life, well, the whole point was you ought to be.
Thank you.
That's probably it. We're probably going right over,
We
right?
are, but
I could just talk all day. People like giving advice.
it's fantastic advice, and honestly, if I had been given and taken it, which is a whole other kettle of fish, when I was in my 20s, I would be ruling the world by now, I think.
You're not ruling the world, Alice? I totally thought you were.
You really have
Ask
to
my
rule
children,
your
they will
world.
confirm that I'm not ruling the world. But for those of you in the room, so my final piece of advice to you is listen to what these fantastic women have to say and learn from them, because that's really good advice. But now, in the sort of remaining 10 minutes or so,
I have 2 small kids, and my career trajectory really started taking off around the time that I had my kids. And one thing is, I find that having kids makes me more productive because I have to balance a lot of different things. So I'm better when I'm busy. I know that. I think that there's a lot of opportunities, and that companies are adapting a little better to women that are making choices about what they're going to do when they have kids. I totally don't think people should do what Sheryl Sandberg suggests, which is when you sit down with your female employees, ask them when they're going to have kids and what the plan should be. That is an HR nightmare. You'll get sued. Don't do it. But, you should talk to your supervisor about it. I mean, your supervisor shouldn't be asking you about it, but you can talk to your supervisor about it if you're comfortable and if you think your supervisor is receptive to that, or to other women, and say, what do you think will happen if I take off a year? What are the kinds of things I could be doing in that year? Could I freelance? Could I, work part-time? But don't let it knock you off course, I think, is my biggest piece of advice. It's a thing in life. It's anything. It could be you're moving because your spouse is moving to a new city, and so now you have to find a new job. I mean, we get thrown off course all the time, and part of being adaptable is figuring out how to make that work to our advantage. That would be my advice.
I just wanted to add to one thing to that. So my children are now all in their 20s, but they weren't always. And I think that one of the things that really, and I think you might already have some of this already, which is good, is that women may give birth to babies, but usually 2 people are actually having a child. And so I think that there's also that conversation that isn't just with your employer, but is with your spouse or your other network that you might have, that, the reality is, and it's your preference. It's also, different women feel differently about what they want to do when they have children, and that's wonderful. I was fortunate enough, actually, oddly enough, I was divorced and remarried to a man whose children these were not. And what he wanted to do and what I wanted to do, it kind of worked perfectly. That he took a lot of responsibility with the kids, with things, because I traveled a lot and things like that. And then I made really good time of the time that I had home with my children. And I've actually asked them. As I said, they're all in their 20s, and I said, I was just gone too much, and they were saying no, and they actually, this is cone of silence stuff. None of you know my ex-husband, but they would say, what they would say is that, well, we are with Dad, and when we're with Dad, he's all over the place, and he's doing work, and he's doing other stuff, and it's like it doesn't matter if we're there. And they said, we won't see you as much sometimes, but when you're there, you're there. You're always there with us. We do things with you. We tell you things. We talk. And so I think that there's a lot of dimension to that. There's how you manage it at work, how you manage it with your spouse or significant other or your own personal network, grandparents or whatnot. And then there's how you manage the time you have with your children. And I think they're all components.
So in case anybody at the back didn't hear, it was raising the issue of other sorts of diversity, racial diversity in particular, which I think we all would acknowledge is a huge problem in our industry. But I think there are two reasons why we wanted to focus on the gender issue here. One was practical. I mean, it's a 45-minute session. We're meant to be finishing in 5 minutes. The conversation has only just started, so we decided that we just needed to keep it focused. The other is that there is a problem with racial diversity in our industry overall in terms of representation. There's a teeny tiny number of ethnic minorities working in scholarly publishing. It's terrible. There's a huge number of women working in publishing, very few at the top. So we felt that was an area that we, it's a slightly different issue to be tackling. They're both completely valid and critical, but it's a little different. But one of the things, this is a good segue, we've been talking a little bit about that we would like there to be some outcomes, ideally, from this conversation, which is very much just a beginning conversation. And one of them that we mentioned to Anne is that maybe SSP could consider the idea of setting up a diversity task force that would look at some of these sorts of issues going forward. And obviously, since she's president, it's a good opportunity to make that pitch. It would
just very, very, very quickly, because I do want to get to more questions. So Angela is the president of CSE, and so we've been kind of talking that we might take it to both of our boards, that maybe we could do some on good October. You can be here representing the Organizational Collaboration Committee as a member. See, there you go. Obviously, I have to catch up on my reading. So, but the idea that maybe, because I think that collaboration too is part of the whole diversity issue, is learning how to collaborate, with different races and ethnicities and genders or whatnot. So I think it would be great if we can figure out a way to collaborate with two organizations and maybe do something that would have some structure and some outcomes, hopefully.
I have a quote from a New York Times article by Sheryl Sandberg and Adam Grant, and from December 2014, and it's focused on gender diversity. But I would be willing to bet a lot of money that this would extend to racial diversity and other kinds of diversity. She said, startups led by women are more likely to succeed. Innovative firms with more women in top management are more profitable. And companies with more diversity have more revenue, customers, market share, and profits. And so it's in our industry's best interest to add that diversity and to focus on diversity, all kinds, gender, racial, whatever. And so I think that's the point I would like to leave the room with, is that it's not a women problem. As Alice said, it's a challenge for our industry, because it's in our industry's best interest. It's in our company's best interest to have more diversity. And
was it diverse gene pools are healthier, right?
Oh my goodness. Okay. October, really quickly, please.